All right, so welcome everyone. This is actually a re-recording of a webinar that we recorded just about 2 weeks ago. We had some audio difficulties and we're going to rerun the recording, so we'll be getting started right now. My name is Nick Bobstar. I'm SVP of Marketing with Bound. And Terry, if you want to give a quick intro and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Terry Flaherty. I'm the Senior Research Director at Serious Decisions in the Demand Creation Strategies practice, and I focus pretty much exclusively on the demand management process and the demand waterfall.
Cool. And then Nina Los Cicero also joined us during the live webinar. And during this re-recording, I'm just going to be covering her parts as well from Rockwell. And so we'll just jump right in. So quick agenda, we're going to go over sort of what the new Serious Decisions Waterfall is, describe a topic that we call welcome marketing. We're really going to focus on understanding your web audience and really understanding what that means to understand your web audience. Describing a little bit about engagement at scale, and then working through and talking through Rockwell's personalization program. So let's jump right in. So we are Bound. We recently renamed ourselves. So it used to be called Get Smart Content, and we've recently switched to Bound, and the company's URL is bound360.com. And what we do is essentially provide insights and drive demand by understanding and engaging your web audience with personalized messaging at scale. And so we'll jump right in here. Terry, do you want to jump in and explain sort of what's going on with the waterfall?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. So as many of you probably have heard or read, back in May of this year, we introduced a new waterfall, and we call this new waterfall the Demand Unit Waterfall. And one of the key things when we think about, sort of the top, and we'll drill into a little more detail on why we introduced this waterfall, but, sort of the core tenet of this new waterfall really is focused on helping drive better alignment between marketing and sales on the outcome of what they're both aiming at, right? And so here we see the marketing view of how marketing typically thinks about measuring success, right? And so in many of the current lead management processes we see today, marketing gets really excited and they say, hey, we just generated 500 leads or 1,000 leads or whatever the case might be. But if we go to the next slide, Nick, what we typically will see on the sales side is sales is much more interested in opportunities, right? And revenue. And one of the big disconnect is that relationship between all these different leads that we have and the potential opportunities that those leads actually represent. And one of the things that we've seen pretty significant change in is that, as organizations start doing much better focus around their go-to-market strategy, around focusing on accounts, they're really targeting buying groups within those accounts, and they're generating leads that are related together. These people are working together, and so the new waterfall helps us align and say, rather than saying here's a whole lot of independent leads, we're really now looking at the lead relationships that we can identify and say here's 5 leads, but the good news about these 5 leads is they're all in the same organization working together to solve that same business problem. And so by better aligning on this concept of a buying group, I think it really helps drive much better alignment between marketing and sales on the outcome, right? So instead of saying, hey, we just generated 1,000 leads, it's really we've identified 35 or 50 or whatever buying groups, and here's where that buying group is in their go-to-market or their purchasing process, decision process.
That's so interesting, just looking at it visually. Marketing for so long has been sort of measured, and their KPIs are around the individual leads, and sales is obviously around opportunities and accounts, and that misalignment can definitely make sense where that can start to drive a fork in the road between the two groups.
Absolutely, yeah, and from both perspectives, right? I mean, number one, sales real question at the end of the day is, great, I have all these leads, but what's it really represent from an opportunity perspective? And then marketing, and they need better insight also on the potential opportunities they're identifying. And so that's where we're seeing the shift is, marketing thinking about identifying and sourcing opportunities as opposed to identifying and sourcing leads, right? And we're still marketing to individual people. We still need to drive engagement, but it's really that analysis and understanding of how these people work together and how I can align them to potential opportunities is the huge upside. So we get a lot of questions, right, around, well, why did we introduce this new waterfall? And we talked a little bit about sort of the need for identifying groups, but there's also a couple other interesting drivers for this new waterfall. And to help understand, sort of the why now, it's kind of interesting to look at the history. Right? And so the first waterfall we introduced was back in 2006, and what was cool about it is it became the industry standard for defining the key stages in the demand management process, right? And it got adopted by thousands of B2B organizations. But in the time period from 2006 to 2012, we saw some major changes occurring in the market, right? And so there was new technology. You probably remember, Nick, that in that time period, that's when marketing automation really got traction, and things like lead scoring, right, really had a huge impact, positive impact on the demand management process. And also things, the tele organizations and telegrouping organizations became a lot more mature, and there was a lot more investment in technology and investment in process around understanding the efficiency and the productivity of the telegroup. And we also had our clients asking us for a way to measure not just the marketing source demand, but get a more holistic view of, well, here's what marketing sourcing, here's what tele is sourcing, and then here's what sales is sourcing, so they have a holistic view of all the drivers of demand. And so, in 2012, we introduced the re-architected waterfall, and it added stages for lead scoring, it added stages for the input and output of tele, and it added stages to look at the different sources of demand, right? But what's interesting, just like there was major changes in technology and process from 2006 to 2012, as I'm sure you've Nick, it's getting faster, right? So from 2012 to 2017, we've seen a lot of new drivers, a lot of new technologies, things like personalization, the ability to identify and understand buyer interest and buyer behavior before they've actually identified who they are, right? And be able to start to drive personalization strategies based on the insight we had with them earlier in the sales process. And so things like that, right? To focus on groups of personas and much more sophisticated go-to-market strategies around campaign design, getting insight and predictive analytics and being able to leverage that from a personalization perspective, and the account-based marketing emphasis we're seeing. All of those were major drivers for us to say, okay, time for a new waterfall. And so in May of this year, we introduced this new waterfall called the Demand Unit Waterfall. And we like to think that this is basically a waterfall family, right? I mean, there's waterfalls that have specific objectives, and the Demand Unit Waterfall is really targeted for organizations who engage with buying groups that are bigger than one, right, and who have technology that they gives them insight earlier into the process, and so that's been sort of the big driver to introduce this new waterfall. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Nick.
Sure.
And so when we launched this thing, actually there were three key concepts that came as part of the launch of the new waterfall. And the first was this thing we call a demand unit, right? And that's where this waterfall got its name. And so demand unit, the best way to think about it is it's a potential opportunity that exists in an account or exists in the market, right? And for a potential opportunity or a demand unit to exist, you really have to have three things, right? There's a buyer, or in this case, a buying group, right? That buying group has to have a business pain, and our solutions need to be able to address those business pains, solve those business pains. And when I have the buyer with that business pain and our solution can address it, those are the building blocks of demand. And when those three elements exist, then that's a point in an account or a point in the market where I can invest, marketing and and sales effort and energy to try to wake up that potential demand and turn it into a closed opportunity. And so, now instead of individual people moving through the waterfall, it's the demand unit that we're identifying and engaging with and qualifying and ultimately closing, right? And that demand unit sort of morphs from a very early stage potential opportunity into the true opportunity that sales thinks about, where they'll then engage and close, right? So that's the first building block. The second building block was what we call a demand map, right? And one of the key things I think everybody understands is that for many organizations, they have a portfolio of solutions, right? And so when we think about taking our solutions to market, either at an account level or at a market level, there's multiple different buying groups that we could be targeting within an organization, right? And we're solving a number of different business pains, and we have a portfolio of our solutions that basically can align to those different buying groups and those business pains. And so the demand map is basically a way for us to align with sales and marketing to be able to say, when we think about going in an account or we think about going in a market, how many demand units or how many potential opportunities do we think exist in that market? And who are the buying groups? What's the business pains, and how do our solutions address it? So this gives us a really powerful roadmap then to be able to say, here's all the points where I can invest marketing, intelligence, sales, energy to drive, sort of conversion of these potential opportunities that we believe exist in the market into, the actual closed deals. And then the way to measure that progression is the last key element. That's this demand unit waterfall. And we'll spend a little bit of time kind of drilling down a little bit more into that. But this is, as I said, it's the demand unit that now moves through the waterfall as opposed to individual people. So
Right,
let's
right.
drill
It
down
just
and take a
strikes.
look at the demand unit waterfall. Sure. Yeah, question there?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, it just strikes me so vividly of how sales has had to manage this on their own,
That's
for
right.
so many folks, right? So they've
Yep.
known that they've got multiple opportunities within an account. They know they have to get multiple personas and buyers, and it's us in marketing that are kind of catching up now and saying, how do we work together? What systems and repeated process do we need to have in place? So it's really cool to see that alignment.
Absolutely, and marketing. I mean, marketing's been targeting people across the buying group, right? But what hasn't happened to date, right, and until we introduced this concept of demand unit waterfall, what was this logical way for marketing to be able to package these people together and say, here's everything we understand about this group of buyers and how it aligns to that business need, and aligns to our solutions. And so it's basically marketing now, creating, essentially opportunities or identifying opportunities very early in the process, and giving the salespeople all the insight we have about the interactions, behaviors of everybody involved with that opportunity, sort of in a single handoff point, as opposed to, we may have had those interactions before, but they were all silos, and we didn't have a construct to be able to tie it all together earlier in the process and hand that off to sales. Right. So, both marketing and sales are kind of aiming at the same goal. It's just we didn't have a really clear delivery mechanism, if you will, to make that happen earlier in the process. So let's talk through this new waterfall, right? And there's what's interesting. There's a couple of new stages that are brand new compared to sort of our re-architected waterfall. There's a few stages that are similar conceptually, right? But the definition evolves a little bit. And then there's some stages that basically stay the same. And so the first stage in the new demand unit waterfall is a stage we call target demand. And this is a brand new stage, right? And this is basically, looking at the market and saying, okay, I'm marketing, for example, enterprise talent management solutions, right? And we're going to help improve the accuracy and the efficiency of the hiring process. And so, we're aiming at, these industries, maybe it's 5 industries, and we're an enterprise level solution. So we're looking for organizations that are $1 billion and above, and that hire, and have key operations on a global basis, right? So the first question then is, well, how many potential opportunities exist in the market as I just defined that? Right. And our buying group is HR, our buying center is HR. We're improving that accuracy of the business of the hiring process, and we have this solution. And so target demand allows us to answer that question that says, there's 6,250 potential opportunities, or 1,000 potential opportunities, or whatever the case might be. And what we've seen, Nick, is this stage is really critical from an alignment perspective, because this helps start, number one, get alignment on market segmentation, and sometimes that isn't as crystal clear as it should be, right? And then within the market segmentation, then agreement around who's the buying group, who's in the buying group, and then lastly, how many exist, right? And it's been surprising how disconnected sometimes we've seen marketing and sales and product on those key parameters, right? So it's been a really good sort of forcing function to drive this alignment and say, let's all agree on not only who we're targeting, but how many we're actually targeting, how many potential opportunities do we think exist.
And have you seen this come around all the way to the budget cycle, to where, your example of there's 6,000 HR units out there, how many do we want to go target, and what's our cost of acquisition, and then what's that going to result, what's the resulting budget, and come around full circle that way?
Yeah, and what's been really interesting. So in the past, right? We had a methodology. A lot of our clients will do. We call it reverse waterfall analysis, right? And to say, okay, for us to drive, $50 million of revenue in this market next year, we can look at our current waterfall conversion and do the math and kind of back up and say, to get these $50 million, it's going to be X number of deals, and all the way up to it's 150 or 200 150,000 inquiries or whatever the case might be, right?
Mhm.
And so then I can start to look at what's my cost per lead. It might cost me $70 to get an inquiry or whatever. But you also have to kind of ground in reality to say, well, it's 150,000 people. Is that even possible? Both from a market sizing perspective and then
Sure.
from a budget perspective, right? And so this is a really good foundational sort of stage from a planning perspective to make sure number one we're agreeing on the number, but also number two how we're going to allocate the budget. But one thing that's interesting, right, is that the next stage I think is really where the budget starts to kick in, right? Because just because there's 1,000 companies or 5,000 companies in the market doesn't necessarily mean I should be aiming at all of them equally at this point, right? And so the next stage is what we call active demand. And active demand is basically also it's a new stage, right? And it's looking at signals in the market to be able to see who we believe is actually in market doing research or has the business need. There's signals of this acute business need where they may not be in market researching yet, but they should be, right? And so this can range from looking at who is coming to my website, or so it's like first party intent data, or I can get third party intent data where I look at some of the intent monitoring vendors or some of the predictive analytic vendors for signals to say they should be in market. And kind of tying it back to the theme of personalization, this is really the first point where we could start to drive very high quality personalization in this interaction, right? So being able to understand that acne is coming to my website, but then recognizing and driving personalization around what we know about acne, right, drives a much better experience and drives higher level engagement. So we're real excited about this stage, and this stage, is really the stage that kind of was created based on the evolution of technologies that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years. We now have the possibility to understand a lot more about prospect interest and behavior and intent before they've actually raised their hand and identified themselves to us.
Yeah, and then the thing that sort of stands out to me as well is the active stage. The key word in personalization for us is persona, and then given the tie back to the buying committees, it's not only is Acme coming to the website, but who at Acme is coming? Is it the finance person? Is it the HR person? And being able to target and talk to those individual folks, I think it's really exciting.
Absolutely, that's huge.
Sorry,
go ahead, Nick. So we sound like the typical conference call, right?
Yeah.
So I was going to say, the whole key thing to drive engagement is relevance, right? And so it's interesting to communicate to somebody at the account level, right? But it's way more significant to be able to communicate to them not just at the account and industry level, but also at their persona level. So understanding that this is somebody that's the senior financial executive just allows you to drive, even more personalization. And the end goal, right, is to get to the next stage. And that next stage is what we call the engaged demand stage. And this one starts to tie back to the other versions of the waterfall, right? Because the first time we saw interaction in the other waterfall, we called it an inquiry, right? And now we're calling it engaged demand. And there's a slight difference in nuance, right? This is basically saying I've got a direct connection with one or more people in that buying group, right? And they self-identified, raised their hand, and now we've got that direct connection where not only do I have their contact information, but they've self-identified, and I understand what they're interested in based on the offer that they just consumed.
Right.
So then our next stage, right, is prioritized demand. And so this is also a stage that aligns to the old waterfall. This is scoring, right? But the big nuance here is instead of scoring individuals, we're scoring across that buying group. And so one of the things we're going to do is every interaction that we see, right, whether somebody downloading a white paper or somebody responding positively to a tele outreach, every interaction we want to basically be able to understand what that interaction is telling us, right? And it's who are they and what are they interested in. And so when I think about that demand unit, the whole goal is we want to drive engagement with as many people in that buying group as we can and be able to logically tie them together. So back to the HR example, the VP of HR comes in and downloads a white paper on talent management best practices. That turns on that demand unit, as you'll see, to become engaged demand. But if I get more people related to that, then I'm adding more and more depth and breadth into that demand unit. Right? And that's what we want to score now, Nick, is not scoring at the individual level, but it's scoring across that group.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then after they are scored and passed over, and then what's the qualified demand look like?
Yeah, so qualified demand aligns to the old, telequalified, sales generated, telegenerated lead. This is basically, everything that we've done up to qualified demand. So, to prioritize is basically applying business rules. We're making assumptions, right? So I think based on who they are, what they've done, I'm going to make some assumptions about, what I think they're interested in, where I think they are in the buyer's journey, what group they belong to, right? And so, and they reach some sort of threshold based on scoring. I was like, okay, it's time to have some real meaningful conversations with these people. And that was the definition of TQL before. So now, instead of TQL, telequalified lead, it's qualified demand. The big nuance is when we're qualifying now, instead of qualifying just that individual. So Fred was the person that was most engaged and became the AQL. The bad practice we saw was only focusing on trying to engage with Fred, right? So I'll make my 5 or 8 or 10 touch attempts. If I don't get Fred to respond, then Fred gets disqualified, but that whole opportunity winds up being disqualified. And what I might not have realized as a teleperson was that Sally and John were also engaged, but they were engaged at a low level because they had specific things they were researching. They didn't reach our lead score threshold, so the tele team didn't have visibility that they should also be reaching out to those people, right? And so now in the new process, not only do we understand that that Fred was involved and engaged, but we also see that Sally and John are also involved. And so if I try to reach Fred and Fred's not engaging, the best practice now is to go, okay, let's go connect with Sally and John. Okay, we're going to qualify at the group level as opposed to the individual.
Right.
And then so do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just say so the last 2 stages, right, pipeline and then closed deals, they're basically identical 2 stages in the previous waterfall, right? Because this is typically where we're thinking about opportunities, right? This is where sales has a lot of their focus. So pipeline, we used to call it SQL, right? And that basically says salespeople have vetted and qualified a deal to the point where an opportunity, right, where they understand what they're going to sell, and they could not only do they understand what they're going to sell, they can put a dollar value on it and a target close date on. So this is a $100,000 deal we're going to close in October. Then that becomes pipeline, and then the last stage is closed, and that's basically identical to the previous waterfall.
Okay.
So that's the waterfall in kind of a really quick 2-minute overview. And what you see is it starts out as targeting, right? We see signals and we start to suspect something's going on. We have a direct connection, and so we're connected, and then we evaluate the depth and breadth of that engagement, and we start to prioritize, and then when we prioritize, we send it over for kind of discussions to move from assumptive to known, right? And then we qualify it more to the point where we think we're going to get this deal. It's in pipeline, and we close that deal.
Right. So let's walk through an example real quick.
Yeah, so a lot of people have questions around kind of this whole question of this mapping. So let me show you, what the mapping looks like when we think about, interactions and how they associate to this new waterfall. And so, let's say back to our HR example that I'm an HR software vendor, and I have 3 main solutions that I'm taking to market, right? So one is, a talent acquisition solution. I've got sort of a core payroll and benefit, and then a learning management solution. And so when I think about taking these solutions in the market, there's 3 potential points of demand, or 3 demand units that exist, that I can aim at across different buying, in the same buying center, but there's 3 different solutions I can take into that buying center. And so let's take a look at like the first interaction. So, Sally comes in, she's the VP of HR, and she downloads a talent management best practice ebook. And so what we understand then is, based on who Sally is and what she is interested in, as you saw, right, that talent acquisition demand unit, we just added Sally to that demand unit, and that demand unit now just progressed to target demand. Right, now let's say we have another interaction. I'm sorry, progress to engaged demand. Sorry about that. So let's say we have another interaction. Maybe a couple days later, we have an anonymous visitor coming to our website. Right? We recognize that they're from Acme. We drive personalization to engage and communicate with Acme. We can even look at the persona And so at that point, right, we just got a signal that says that this organization, Acme, is also interested. Someone in Acme is interested in core payroll and benefits, and so that demand unit now is at active demand. And based on that insight, right, I can do things like ad targeting. I could do things like outbound tele to the people that we think are part of that buying group, right? A couple days later, let's say that we launched that tele outreach, or we had a website, visitor come in, and Tom identified himself, and we personalized our website. They responded and they accepted the offer, and so now I've got two demand units that are progressing, both at the engaged demand stage, right? So there's two potential opportunities now that exist in Acme for two of our solutions. And then, kind of the last interaction, just to close the loop on how this all ties together, is now we've got Helen, and Helen's the director of talent management, and she comes in and attends a webinar on hiring accuracy and efficiency. That she gets linked back to that talent acquisition demand unit, and now we went from engaged demand, as you'll see, that demand is going to move to prioritized demand, and we're going to send it over to teller sales for human conversations, and to start taking and vetting the assumptions and actually getting proven insight around that account. So that's the way things start to tie together, just kind of a process flow perspective within the new demand unit waterfall. And what you'll see, right, is that it's basically giving us the visibility then of here's this buying group, here's what I understand as far as the level of engagement and what they're interested in. So another really cool thing about this waterfall is the introduction of new metrics that come with this, right? And so we can start answering questions like, how are we doing against our market potential? So it's interesting to know we closed 50 deals last quarter. Is that 1%, 5%, 10%, 50% of our total market that we're aiming at, right? And so that's an interesting data point to understand. And then, also we understand things like, of the organizations that we're engaged with, how efficient is our engine to convert the engaged demand down to a closed deal. That's what we did with the old waterfall or original waterfall. But there's also some new metrics around things like targeting accuracy, right? Of I might be getting 1,000 people to raise their hand, but how many of them are actually ones that I can map into business solutions, into demand units, right? And I might not map them because they're really not in our market, right? Or they're not a key role, or they're not doing behavior that really makes sense to us. And so we can start to see, of the people that are raising their hand, how many are the people that we really are interested in caring about. And that's a really important metric, right? And then depth and breadth of engagements, the most powerful new set of metrics. So if our buying center is 10 people, how many do we have engaged, and how engaged are they, right? And that helps drive things like scoring, but it's also a new metric. And obviously the goal, the more people that are engaged, either by marketing touches or tele-touches or sales touches, the more people engaged in that demand unit, the higher the propensity of that demand unit to actually turn into a closed deal.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating transition, and I think a great step forward for both sales and marketing organizations that are trying to get aligned and really think about things in the same vein. One of the things is transitioning and personalization from that waterfall a bit is that we feel like that disconnect where marketers have been sort of putting out a lot of content, a lot of good content, has led to this behavior where they oftentimes get ignored. So in other words, the person that, in your example on the HR example, if you're putting out content that doesn't speak to the individual person in the buying group that they're in, we start to see this behavior where prospects are simply tuning us out. Marketing Magazine had a great stat where it said 94% of customers are simply disengaged, right? Because they don't see the right irrelevant messages. And so this is the opportunity that's in front of us from a personalization perspective. And the way we think about this is how we get back to welcome marketing. And I feel like, in the marketing space, it's a really interesting time to be a marketer because you have access to all this data, this great alignment to sales. And yet oftentimes we have this notion of what we call static marketing, which ultimately leads to irrelevance. It's essentially your marketing getting ignored because you're not talking to the prospect in the way that they understand their problem and understand their solutions. And then that leads to what we call personalized marketing, which ultimately increases relevance. And that, again, becomes welcome marketing. I think all of us as marketers can look at our inbox and see the unsolicited, emails and phone calls that just have nothing to do with what our challenges are. And, the challenge in front of us is to get back to what we call welcome marketing. And, we see an interesting analogy here where sales reps do this really well. We feel like, in our company at Bound, we feel like the old adage of an elevator pitch is kind of dead. Is that really good sales reps, they don't use the same pitch every time. They really start to understand who their buyers are. They look for cues. Is this someone more senior? Is this someone more junior? And then they adjust their conversation depending on who they are. And the story we like to tell is that your website should do the same. It should start to identify who's coming to the site. It should adjust it as necessary. And this is a great quote from Shea & Company, and essentially says that folks saw a 19% lift in sales just from website personalization. So we've seen clients have similar results from us as well. To be able to do that, to sort of think about the human intuition that's required to be able to adjust a message, we feel like a platform needs to have two things. It's one, understanding that audience, and then delivering a scalable way to increase that engagement. And so the way we've approached this is through this technology that we call 360 persona. And so really it boils down to there's 5 attributes that we really need to understand to be able to engage with a prospect the right way. The first one's essentially firmographics, about the company that they're at. The second one's demographics, about the individual person. The third is offsite intent, and you mentioned this earlier, Terry, about the active stage. It's understanding what someone was doing prior to coming to your site. And then the fourth one's on-site. It's once they're on the page, what behavior are they exhibiting? And then finally, there's a key one in marketing automation. So we're going to take a couple seconds to just dive into each of these because I think they're really relevant. And Nina from Rockwell, spoke really eloquently during the live webinar about how the automotive segment is a really interesting industry for them. And when they recognize that someone is from the automotive industry, they really go out of their way to put forth case studies and content that speaks to how Rockwell is able to address automotive needs. And so there's all kinds of attributes here, from company name to industry to is this a small business or a large business, that you may want to adjust your message to when it comes to folks coming to the site. The second one's demographic, and this one's about the individual person. And so we have a great partnership with LinkedIn where we can pull back and identify different attributes about the individual folks and start to use those to personalize. So, per your comment earlier, Terry, understanding if someone's a CIO or a VP of finance or a marketing manager has a great deal of influence on who they are in that buying group. And this is finally an opportunity for us to personalize the content, personalize the message when it comes to offering the solution that each of the vendors is offering in terms of how they address that individual person. The third one is, again, the third-party intent data. And so we use Bombora. And if you're not familiar with Bombora, they have a great technology that scours the web and really watches when visitors are engaging with different media properties as well as on-site directly on other vendors' properties. And it can identify what intent they've got. And so this is just a real quick example. This is the Serious Decisions homepage. And on that homepage, there's a small section that tries to identify the priorities that Sirius covers. And it takes you to a page where it says, okay, you might be a demand marketing leader, and so you select that demand marketing leadership position, and then you finally end up on a page that articulates how Sirius can help demand marketing leaders. Well, with the offsite intent data, and Bombora's partnership, we could identify if someone is a demand marketing leader or has been consuming demand marketing topics and concepts, and then bypass that first page and even that second page and just take them to the offer that's most compelling to them, which is, how could Sirius help demand marketing leadership? So it's really compelling to be able to accelerate the engagement on the site using this types of technology. The fourth one, again, is the on-site behavior. So this one we feel like is a really interesting one, and we've all been a part of sites that as soon as you're on the site, the first thing that pops up is an online chat, and it can be very disruptive. One example we've had clients use very successfully is to hold that chat until the third visit. So you can do things along the lines of number of times visited, time on site, the device that they're using. And we had another client that essentially launched or triggered a request a demo, and they waited until the person was on the site for more than 3 minutes. And so then at that point, it's a much more compelling call to action. They're much more interested in engaging. And it can have a significant lift in the conversion of the site. The fourth one's kind of a catch-all of marketing automation. For a lot of folks, when it comes to their web visitors, they essentially break down into one of two buckets. There's the known users and then the unknown users. And we've talked quite a bit about the unknown users and the type of personalization that you can deliver. But for many users, you have your existing customers or even known prospects that come to the site, and you can identify through your marketing automation. You oftentimes have a lot of fields that you already know about a person. So for example, is this a customer that has an open pipeline deal? Is this a current customer, or are they a prospect? Is this someone that has scored us on an NPS score high or low? And depending on that, you can trigger a bunch of different engaging campaigns to help drive that person, not only from a purchase perspective, but oftentimes from a post-purchase perspective. So if they brought product A, you can potentially upsell them product B. We use a number of different marketing automation partnerships here. Marketo and Eloqua are the two that most folks are finding really helpful. And this is just a really interesting way to personalize the content as well. So one question we get oftentimes from clients and prospects is, how do you go about building a personalization strategy? And so we have a framework that we like to use, and essentially it includes 5 elements. And we're just going to walk through each of these different elements. The first one is to simply ask this question of, what business challenge are we trying to solve? Is it a challenge of trying to increase the conversion from the active to engaged stage? In other words, driving those initial inquiries? Is it a pipeline acceleration challenge? Is it a post-purchase challenge, trying to get someone to upsell, renew, or cross-sell to another product? And once you have a good understanding of that, then we start to get into, okay, how are we going to solve this challenge? What's the play that we're going to run? Are we going to try to target this person from an industry-based perspective, meaning when they see, are we going to identify their industry and start to take them down a path that explains how we help folks in that industry? Are we going to look to programs that depend on the type of content they consume? So for example, if you've viewed a certain white paper, you want them to see a subsequent webinar or another play that's sort of along the lines of that content journey. The third one is essentially, how are you going to target these visitors? What tools and data sources are you going to use to target? And we have a number of partnerships that we use. We mentioned the LinkedIn one and Bombora, Clearbit and Kickfire are another great partners of ours that help us identify who those anonymous users are. And then of course there's the known users as well in Marketo and Eloqua. And then Bound itself has a data source primarily along the lines of behavioral activity as well. And those all feed into the personalization strategy in terms of what campaigns we want to roll out. And finally, how are you going to, not finally, but the fourth one is essentially how are you going to deliver this message? Are you going to deliver this as a triggered live chat? In other words, we have a client that does this successfully. On that third visit, they identify healthcare folks or folks in the healthcare industry and ask if they want to talk to their healthcare specialist. And they route those chats to, sure enough, someone that is much more of an expert with their healthcare clients. We have other options that allow you to change the graphics on the website itself, change the text itself. You can embed HTML or CSS, completely changing the experience on the page itself. And then finally, this is much like most things in marketing, this is an iterative process. So what are we trying to optimize towards? Is it that initial inquiry conversion? Is it reducing the time on site? Increasing the time on site, but reducing the bounce rate? And then knowing all of this, we set in place a core strategy, and then we simply iterate and try to improve along those lines. And so I want to transition now. So again, I'm going to speak on behalf of Nina and Rockwell. They've launched 3 very successful programs, and we wanted to walk through a little bit about the strategy of how they've rolled out each of these. The first one's a role-based program, and they have one called the Connected Enterprise of these. The second one's an industry-based one where they're really trying to accelerate deals in the automotive space. And the third one's essentially another industry-based one for oil and gas folks. And so the first one is, again, their Connected Enterprise one, which they call supervisors. And so again, back to the framework that we just discussed, the solution that they're after is essentially conversion optimization, trying to get that initial conversion. The plays that they use are role-based. They're going to use targeting from Eloqua. They're going to change the homepage experience and ultimately try to drive towards an increased click-through rate. And so this is a quick snapshot of our app itself, and essentially we pull from an Eloqua segment that they've already created that identifies these connected enterprise folks. And then once we see those folks, once our software sees someone from that segment on the website, then we deploy an experience. And so this is just a quick snapshot of the results. And essentially they had 3 different campaigns going. One which was to identify someone's geo and drive them towards a more geo-specific message. The second one was an industry-based one. And then the third one was again, they're part of that Eloqua segment from the Connected Enterprise, and they engage with those managers and supervisors, and they see, no doubt, nearly 10x lift on the overall click-through rate. The second example was the automotive industry example. So again, they're trying to accelerate deals that they've got with automotive clients in pipeline deals. And they have an Eloqua list that they pull from the account list of open pipeline customers. And the tactic that they wanted to use was show them that a really powerful case study that they have with Tata Motors. And the results they were trying to drive towards was drive in growth in pages per visit. In other words, have those folks engage with the site more. Overall improvement of time on site, and then of course form submission. So this is just a real quick mock-up of the actual campaign itself, and so they have a fly-in that pops up pointing to that Tata Motors case study, and the results sort of speak for themselves. But the 30% lift in the overall pages per session for the folks that saw the personalization versus didn't, they saw an increased lift of about 16% for the duration on the site, and then again an 82% in not just the Tata Motors case study inquiry, but the subsequent inquiries that those visitors took, downstream. And then Terry, to your point, that ultimately helps drive towards the qualified and prioritized stages in driving more of those inquiries, which drives folks past the lead scoring threshold.
Exactly, that's great.
Yeah, and then in the oil and gas industry, they similarly have taken an approach identifying that industry, and here they use LinkedIn to identify which industry they're in, and then they do some text and graphics swap outs. So let's look at the results here. Before we get there, this is the campaign itself, so this little module that's in red changes dynamically depending on if someone's in the oil and gas industry, and sure enough, they see really good engagement when they are in that industry. So nearly 87% page view increase, 16% again duration, decrease in bounce rate, which is obviously great to keep those folks on site, and then subsequent inquiries over 122% or 122% increase there. So again, not only the initial engagement with the site, but also subsequent inquiries, which goes to show it's not just that initial inquiry, it's more the folks are engaged all the way throughout the waterfall. So real quick, just to wrap things up in terms of how Nina got started, we feel like the first and foremost thing that you need to be able to get right with personalization is just to identify your audience, to get some perspective for which buying groups are attending, which personas within those buying groups are attending. And in this webinar, we're offering for registrants of the webinar, we're offering a complimentary service, which is really cool, which essentially do a 2 or 3 week audit of your website to identify who's actually coming there, and we'll provide a great report that details who's coming to the site. And for some folks, that's a very compelling report, and for a lot of folks, it actually translates to the next stage, which is strategy development. Is there a strategy that makes sense to engage with that audience and deliver those personalized campaigns? And then ultimately, that leads to a campaign launch where we actually deliver those campaigns. And one of the ways we like to think about this is the different personas really fall into one of these 4 buckets. Essentially, you can either have we'll go back to the example with the HR folks, if you have key folks from an HR perspective and they're coming in high traffic, but they're not engaging very well, and we sort of articulate engagement as engagement with the site, number of page views, number of visits that they have with the actual site, well, then you can drive off a strategy that says you need to optimize and come up with better content. And then vice versa, if you have folks that are really well engaged, again, with whichever persona that you're targeting, for really poor traffic, well, then you need to reevaluate the sources that you have for traffic, potentially paid media, to drive more traffic to the site because you're engaging them really well. And so we feel like this is a really helpful exercise to go through to actually help identify the personalization strategy. This is just a report from Rockwell as well that identified a couple of interesting areas. So again, the automotive section here had a relatively low engagement score, and so that's what kicked off the personalization effort to drive more folks to the engaging content that they already have, and so they're able to see an increase in the engagement for those customers themselves. And then finally, to be able to do personalization well, we feel like you always have to have a dedicated team. It's not one of those things you just turn on and then never look back. Like most things in marketing, you kind of have to turn it on, look at the results, optimize, and go back and forth. And there's sort of 2 ways that we allow, or we recommend folks do it. One is what we call consulting services, where we essentially help you as a client, do the personalization programs. And then the other one's a managed services model where we actually do it. So that means changing the content, adjusting towards those optimization results on an ongoing basis. And finally, we have a number of other customers, and during the live webinar, we actually went through a couple of questions. And so, Terry, if you're up for it, I'll ask a couple of those, and then we can keep folks wrapped up in under the hour.
Yeah, that's fine. That's great.
Yeah, so the first one that came up was, what have you seen as the biggest challenge when folks are considering moving to the new waterfall?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two challenges, right? And the first one is process, and then the second is probably more technology oriented. And so the first one around process really centers around being able to identify the demand units that are relevant for them, right? And so what you have to do, right, which is really critical, is have a conversation with sales around who they're selling to, look at the opportunity history and who they have engaged with those, in those opportunities. Just get a really good understanding of, like I said, the market segments, the buying groups, the business needs, and then how the solutions map into that, right? And that's sort of the foundational first step in being able to migrate to, number one, the Demand Unit Waterfall, but just a much better aligned go-to-market strategy with sales. On the tech side, it's really a question, and probably the biggest question I get is, where does the demand unit exist? Because if I look at my current tech stack, there's not an entity called demand unit anywhere, right? And a couple different approaches. We see a lot of organizations that leverage like the opportunity entity, right, in their Salesforce automation systems, and add stages that are early in the process. So they're basically creating opportunities much earlier in the process, and then mapping and driving business logic to progress those opportunities to the point where it then gets transferred over to sales. And there's a few other alternatives, but I think those two are probably the biggest challenges. Number one is just, where are we aiming, who are we aiming at, and why? And then number two is, what's the system changes we need to make in order to be able to track these things?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think most marketers sort of don't think about the opportunity nearly as much as obviously salespeople, and so re-architecting and boy, that can certainly require a lot of alignment to go poke the bear when it comes to what we're going to call an opportunity. But I absolutely agree. I think it's a great way for you systematically to start to be able to measure it, and certainly you can use your existing systems just with some tweaks to be able to get there.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, I had a call with the client a couple of weeks ago, right? And they started out the conversation saying, we're all in on account-based marketing, right? And we have 600 accounts that we're interested in, and we're not interested in anything else other than the 600 accounts. And I'm like, okay, cool, right? And then we started talking about the Demand Unit Waterfall, and they're like, well, wait, we're gonna have to talk to sales and understand who the buyers are in those accounts. And it's like, if you're putting all your money, you're going all in on 600 accounts, it's marketing's responsibility to understand and the characteristics of those accounts as much as it's sales responsibility, right? Because you're making a corporate bet. So, it's critical for that alignment to occur.
Right. One last question was more around where do folks struggle when it comes to considering personalization? So I can tackle this one first, and feel free to chime in. I think one of the areas that we feel like folks struggle most is essentially just personalization. There's sort of two sides of it. One is just the underlying data of who is coming to your website, which personas they are, and understanding their behaviors. And then the second part is what experience do you want to deliver? And we feel like, the more important of those is really in the understanding the audience. And, I think it's the irony of this is it's completely jives with the waterfall as well, is that's been the mistake that I think marketers have had is not being able to systematically understand those personas and then do something. The old analogy that I always give is that, we had a client that was targeting data scientists, and we asked them for their persona, and they pulled out the old slide that's, here's Data Dan, and, they've got a PowerPoint slide that says he's, 35 to 40 years old and makes this much money, and, various attributes, which are great, but then you ask them, great, how many Data Dans came to the website last week? And they have no way to quantify it. And so that's one of the things that we've seen as a transition. And then Terry, anything to add there as it comes to sort of the active stage as well?
Yeah, I think the thing I think is really interesting with what you guys are doing is that active demand stage. We envision it being at the account level, right, which is interesting and actionable, but being able to understand it's data Dan, right? Number one gives me a great way to personalize and try to drive interaction. To get them in the moment of that experience when they're on the website to try to get them to convert, right? I can start personalizing and tailoring messages specifically to them. But even at the active demand stage, just understanding the insight, it was Data Dan. We don't know his name, obviously, but we know it's Data Dan and we know that persona. And then being able to do things like launch very targeted outbound tele effort. If we didn't get Data Dan to engage, to convert, still understanding the persona that engage, that takes active demand to the next stage, right? Because it's active demand at the persona level as opposed to the account level, and that's super powerful.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I want to be conscious of our time, and I really want to thank you, Terry, for not only doing the live webinar, but also rejoining us for this re-recording. What's the best way for folks to stay in touch and see you next?
So we're going to be at TechX next week, and so just as a relative time period, so that's October 30th through November 2nd, TechX in Austin. Sirius always does a variety of webinars and forums and things around, topics like the Demand Unit Waterfall and personalization. So, go to SiriusDecisions.com and you can see our events or reach out to Sirius if you have questions, and we'll be glad to help you out.
Okay. That sounds great. Well, I want to thank you again, Terry, for joining. It was really fun to walk through, these different topics and start to see the waterfall come to life with clients as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks again. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.